So as Hilda said, I'm going to talk about something a little bit controversial, which is a critique of the Nordic model of active transport and bicycling. And it's not something I have necessarily been working on for a long time, but I have been working on a book project called Mobility Justice: The Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes. And that will be published by Verso in September. And in the process of writing about mobility justice, I became aware, unexpectedly, that there were activist groups in the United States who were using the concept of mobility justice, and they were doing it from a critical perspective of racial justice as well as other marginalized identities, gender, sexualities, and so on, and a kind of intersectional approach. So I wanted to share that with you today because I thought it would be an interesting contribution to the conversation. But this does come out of a US context in a way, which is very different. But I thought, well, that's a good way to reflect on the Nordic context by kind of contrast with the US. So let's see how this works. Oops, that's not the thing I want. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong clicker. Okay. So I'm going to begin by just saying a little bit about what I've started taking to calling kinopolitics, meaning, the combination of kino, movement, and politics, so the politics of movement. And I know some of you may not come from a sort of mobilities research background. I think there's some who are more in transport studies here. So I thought I should introduce mobilities research a little bit. And the way we approach mobilities within this kind of field of what John Arey and I called the new mobilities paradigm was to focus on the constitutive role of movement within the workings of most social institutions and social practices. So the idea that movement comes first, and then things, subjects, cities, space kind of emerges out of these movements, intersectional movements. So it focuses on the organization of power around systems of governing mobilities and immobilities, or timing and speed, or channels and barriers to movement at various scales. So it's interested not just in transportation and physical displacement, but all kinds of different systems of governing mobilities. And it focuses not on movement itself alone, but also on the power of discourses, practices, and infrastructures of mobilities in creating what I sometimes call the effects of movement and stasis. So the appearance of movement, or the story of movement as contrasted with non-movement or stillness, or demobilization and remobilization, or voluntary and involuntary movement. So there's different ways to think about movements. And as Malena Freudenthal-Petersen has said, it's not just a story of freedom of movement, right? That's one story, but there are many other unfreedoms that might be associated with mobility. So such discourses, practices, let's see if this works. Not getting this clicker right. Wrong side. Discourses, practices, and infrastructures are culturally shaped by what we can think of as mobility assemblages. And people have been writing about assemblages, drawing on Tim Cresswell's use of the word constellations of mobility. So constellations of actors, actions, and meanings that are influenced by mobility regimes, to use another concept that Sven Kesselring has developed, mobility regimes that govern who and what can move or stay put, when, where, how, under what conditions, and with what meanings. And what I want to emphasize today, this comes from a group who I'll be talking about, one of these activist groups who work on mobility justice. And it's the idea of this intersectionality. And assemblages of mobility are always intersectional, meaning they're assemblages of race, gender, class, age, ability, and modes of transportation. And as they put it, as we pass through public spaces like streets, we experience multiple kinds of security and insecurity due to social attitudes towards this intersectionality, but I would add to that, we experience many other things because of the intersectionality of this kind of assemblage. So mobilities are organized in and through mobility regimes and uneven infrastructure spaces that are intersectional and that often simultaneously presuppose and reproduce immobile others. So any kind of mobilities kind of presuppose immobile others. And I think about that in terms of mobilities never being free, but they're always channeled or tracked or controlled or governed. They're under surveillance or always unequal in one way or another. And you could think of it as just people self-surveilling each other, so they don't crash into each other as like the most simple level, up through all sorts of complex systems of, how we gaze and look at each other, interact with each other as we're moving around. And gender is one really crucial, fundamental part of that action that happens when we're moving. And mobility regimes, according to Kesselring and Gerlinde Vogel, can be defined as systems of disciplining and channeling movements and mobility by way of principles, norms, and rules which shape movement, space, behavior, and conduct. So there's these kind of underlying norms and rules that kind of govern our mobilities, and the performance of gender is one of those underlying kind of expectations of behavior, but also different kinds of racial and ethnic performances of normative and non-normative sexualities, of different kinds of abilities, differential abilities. All of that is happening. And as you can tell, this is a very sociological approach, and I'm drawing a lot on sociologists. And good thing we're in a department of sociology, so that's okay here. So these norms and rules of behavior and conduct, they can take a material form because they're built into the very infrastructure of cities and streetscapes. Cities rely upon this exceptional scale of connections, networks, and flows, with infrastructure being, you could define as the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities needed for the operation of society or enterprise. That's like a dictionary definition of infrastructure. So mobility regimes generate these kind of dynamic topologies of infrastructure spaces of movement. And you can think of those as being uneven because they allow some bodies to kind of move through with ease or comfort or speed. And the same infrastructure can have the effect of slowing others and making their movements difficult. When we think about accessibility and universal design, right? Everyone's familiar with like, oh, well, the stairs, that's how I get to the next floor, but for other people it's a huge barrier, or it could just be a pavement or whatever. But you can also think of it at a much bigger scale in terms of borders, gates, and legal regimes of detaining people, expelling people, deporting them, and so on. And when we talk about smart cities or smart mobilities, which I understand is to be part of the topic here, although I might be taking smart in a much more technological sense than maybe you are using it to talk about all kinds of ways of being smart in how we move around. But smart cities, in the technological sense, add a kind of new informational overlay to such processes. And I'll come back to that later in the talk. So in relation to our topic of gendering smart mobilities, this means that we need to begin from a critical perspective. And I was very struck when I came across this activist group, they're called the Untokening, that they said things like this. They said we need to discard best practices, respond to local needs. Social movements oriented towards streets and mobility prioritize planning models and political advocacy without addressing communities' disillusionment with and distrust of government systems. This often results in the use of colonial, oppressive, or inaccessible language and designs and ideas that export Eurocentric best practices rather than responding to local needs. So here was a grassroots kind of activist community within US cities like Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, and they're criticizing the export of Eurocentric best practices, including this bicycling model, the Copenhagenized model, so to speak. And they said that's not going to work in our cities, and it's not what we need. And they point out that streets, infrastructure, and transportation are intimately tied to the human experience, and that for many, mobility is shaped by deliberately designed barriers, including the use of highways or rail lines to divide communities, and the stigmatization of transportation methods used by low-income and communities of color. And so when you bring bicycling advocacy into a context like that, it has a different meaning. It performs different things. And so in order to think about gender and active transport and smart cities, I want to controversially call into question the best practices of the Nordic region and the kind of language that's used in advocating and promoting these models, but especially the sites in which the models are developed, and to think about the ways in which, as they've been imported into other countries, they've often excluded women in some ways, because many of the active transport advocacy groups are male-dominated. But also racial and ethnic minorities, people with differential abilities. So as soon as you start talking about active transport and walking and bicycling, who are you excluding? And then also other sexualities and different bodies that face different kinds of insecurity in public space. And so what does it mean to bring in a model of active transport based on a kind of a normative body, like that we all can do this? And I'm sure that the Nordic model has thought about this. I'm not saying they have ignored these issues, but as it gets imported, some of that might sort of fall away, the sort of complexities of what it means to do active transportation. So I'm going to give a little bit of a theoretical background, and then I'll move on to the sort of activist movements. So just really briefly thinking about some of the key concepts that I draw on and thinking about mobilities, it kind of goes back to the spatial turn in the social sciences. And that's, really associated kind of with Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, which was, published back in the 1970s, but it kind of got picked up in the 1980s in the Anglophone context. And then Doreen Massey's influential book, Spatial Divisions of Labor, in 1984, and her subsequent work. And these theorists examined the kind of movement of capital into and out of place, and how that resulted in a kind of sedimentation and spatial formation occurring within different places, and that there were therefore struggles over space and its production, what Lefebvre called the production of space. And Massey's work influenced the emergence of a kind of relational analysis of space, emphasizing that space was the product of interrelations and always under construction. So that spatial turn influenced both my own work when I was in graduate school and John Urry's work at that time, which also was concerned with space and social relations. And this led to Urry's idea of mobile sociology and what he called sociology beyond societies at the turn of the millennium. And right around that time, I went to Lancaster University as a lecturer and started working with him. And that kind of led to us sort of having these conversations about mobilities, and eventually kind of creating the Center for Mobilities Research and the journal Mobilities and so on. So within that work, issues of uneven mobility have become really crucial to the field. And I would say there's increasing attention to concepts such as differential mobility, uneven mobility, and the idea of motility as the kind of potential for movement, and that people have different mobility capabilities, different mobility potentials, and in general, what Elliott and Urry have called network capital as a way to think about this distribution of motility. So the idea of network capital is that all people have different capacities and potentials for movement. And we can, in general, say that privileged groups, or what are sometimes some people call the kinetic elite, control more potentials. That is, they enjoy greater ease of movement and can access a wider range of different kinds of mobility, but they also can move things to them more easily. So it's not just that they move around all the time, but it's that the world moves around them. They move through the world easily. That's the idea of having a lot of network capital. And Elliot and Uri describe it as having access to various things like passports and visas for appropriate documents that make it easy to travel, having qualifications such as education or professional standing or language ability, a sort of cultural capital, having physical capacities for movement, anything from the kind of clothing you might have to nutrition to an environment that kind of fits your body, and vehicles and infrastructures. So those are all what I would call a kind of mobility capital, and as well, of course, as financial capital, right? And access to bank accounts and Wi-Fi and information on the move and all of those things. So all of this kind of comes together in this idea of network capital. So there's this uneven distribution of those capacities, and many people do not have access to this kind of ease of mobility. They may face impairments due to design features, as I mentioned, such as mundane as stairways or lack of public toilets, right, which became a big issue as women became more mobile, the demand for public toilets, but now for gender nonconforming people, that's become a major issue of political conflict in the United States. I don't know how much it happens here. And just otherwise inaccessible transport systems. And people might face other kinds of friction every time they move around in public places, from whistling, cat calls towards people on the streets, to racial aggression aimed at minorities, to rules that exclude homeless people or street vendors from sidewalks. So there's all different ways in which people's mobilities are sort of delimited socially. And also people might be made, economically be forced to live far from city centers or easy access to transportation in peripheral neighborhoods that lack good transportation. Or they might be in what in the US are called food deserts, where it's very hard to get good fresh foods because they're not brought into your neighborhood. So, we see all of these ways in which people have low network capital and they can't access mobilities for a wide range of reasons. And I've used the term kinopolitical, drawing on the work of the philosopher Thomas Nail, who combines movement with politics in the idea of a kinetic politics, which recognizes not just that there's a politics around mobility, but that mobilities are formative of political relations. Like, political relations come out of differential mobilities. So there's complex combinations of movements and moorings within these mobility regimes that produce differential subjects. And that is the sort of basis of kinopolitics. So that's a really brief kind of overview of some of the kinds of issues or philosophical approaches and terminology that we use in the field. And I think it's important just to give a little taste of that background, because the terms might come up and you might be like, well, where did that come from, or what does that mean? But now I want to move to this much more direct discussion of these activist movements, which should be a little more fun. So that's, okay, the boring part. So first, Slow Roll Chicago, and a group called Equiticity. So I think at this point we can learn a lot from social movements that are developing a critique of existing projects of urban planning and transport planning, and in particular the kind of critique of the typical forms of predominantly white bicycle advocacy and transport planning, and predominantly male, at least in the US it still really is. And the questions that these groups raise, I believe, are applicable to thinking about gendered mobilities and different parts of the world that may not have the same kind of racial or ethnic formations, but may have other kinds of ways in which this work is transferable to thinking about it. So above all, these groups, like this one called Slow Roll Chicago, and another one I'll refer to in a minute called the Untokening, they call for space and resources for people of color, women, and others historically excluded from transport planning to envision and implement actions from their own knowledge base. And they say, like, we begin with different experiences from different locations, different embodiments, and we have to begin from those places, and that we all can contribute to theorizing mobility justice, producing knowledge about mobility justice, as well as trying to bring about real transformations towards more equitable mobility and urban planning. And they actually use the word equity, and they reject the word equality, because they say equality would just mean that we're trying to make everyone the same, but we're starting from a site of oppression and loss of resources, and we want equity, which means kind of bringing us up to a level that, and maybe bringing others down a bit in terms of certain access and freedoms. In North American cities, these groups have started this kind of pro-bicycling advocacy, but said that it's ignored issues of equity and justice. So the Slow Roll Chicago movement is one that it was founded in 2014, so it's very recent, by Jamal Julian and Olatunji Obayi Reed. It came out of an earlier group called Slow Roll Detroit, but the Chicago one is kind of the most active right now. And they build on community bicycling events. They hold community bike rides in order to advocate for what they call racial equity, increased mobility, and racial justice to make lives better for Black, brown, and indigenous people of color across the United States. So they mobilize bicycling not just as a form of transportation, but they emphasize it's a tool to build community health, social cohesion, bring jobs to their communities, and that all of that in turn will help counter urban violence, so gun violence in the United States, which they feel bringing people together to go on these slow community bike rides can help build trust, cohesion, and fight against violence on the streets. So it's a surprising form of bicycle advocacy. It's not about transportation, and it's not about, how do you get to work each day or something like that. So they de-emphasize cycling as transportation, which is completely against the mainstream bicycle advocacy groups that are always saying bicycling is transportation too, and we need to fix our transportation system to include bicycling. So as co-founder, Obayi Reed explains it, he says the aim is to bring communities together in a ritual of social cohesion where they can move together in public space, share stories, and in doing so improve their health, rebuild community trust, and so on. And their motto is, "We ride bikes to make our neighborhoods better." And so that's their motto. This is some of their principles, which is equitably distributing bicycle resources to those who need them most. That's what they call bicycle equity. Community ownership of the transportation bicycle planning process. So they're very against planners coming in with a plan for the community, holding a stakeholder meeting and saying like, okay, are you guys okay with, here's our plan, can you please give it your okay? Really, you want this bicycle lane. But as we mentioned, in the US, there's a strong what's called bike-lash against bicycle lanes because they're associated with gentrification and people being priced out of their neighborhoods. And so they want community ownership of bicycle planning processes that respects the needs, culture, and history in our neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that have been marginalized, neighborhoods that have had transportation infrastructure that has really hurt them or excluded them or divided them from the city in the more desirable parts of the city. They don't want bicycling to reproduce that, and they don't want bike lanes to reproduce that. And why they do it, they want bicycling for, not transportation, for reducing violence, improving health, creating jobs, and making our neighborhoods more livable. And I think you can think about all of their strategies in relation to gender also. And they talk about the 4 C's: community, culture, context, and clarity. So creating and connecting communities, building an equitable, diverse, and inclusive bicycle culture, context, hosting neighborhood-based bicycle rides in partnership with community organizations, and clarity, expressing in consistent, inspiring, and clear terms who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And these are all things that are kind of absent from mainstream, like, transport planning practices, I would say, and the way transport planners are taught, like, well, this is what we do, and it's about transportation, and we consult stakeholders, and then we kind of implement it. This is like a beginning from a completely different starting point. And I think if we think about it as a gendered process, it would be interesting to think on what we can learn from that. So their goals, so Reed, the founder of Slow Roll Chicago, has a new organization that was just launched last month called Equiticity. And Equiticity advocates around wider mobility justice issues. And some of their kind of goals are that equity is achieved by eliminating inequities and disparities that adversely impact marginalized people. And equity is achieved when disadvantaged people have the opportunity to achieve optimal life outcomes, reach their full potential, and no one is deprived from achieving their full potential due to their race, gender, sex, economic position, or other socioeconomic determinants. Bicycle equity, third, requires the fair distribution of bicycle resources, funding, power, protected bike lanes, bike share stations, other infrastructure, prioritizing the communities and people who are in a disadvantaged position. And wouldn't it be interesting if a sort of gendered bicycling advocacy began from those kinds of equity principles and thought about who is this serving, whose needs does this serve, and who is it helping advance more equitable mobilities across an entire city or region more broadly. Bicycle equity, fourthly, decrees the activity of cycling as a human right. Disadvantaged people have the human right to engage in the activity of cycling in a manner which is safe and secure, free from the risk of interpersonal, vehicular, or structural violence. And I think it's important to think about what are the violences or the insecurities that urban forms and mobility regimes produce, who suffers from those violences, and how can bicycling equity help kind of overturn some of that violence. Okay. So, let me talk a little bit about the second project, the Untokening project. That's this one. So you can find out about it at theuntokening.org. And the untokening means that they use that term to mean we don't want there to be a token woman in the room or a token racial minority in the room within a white male planning process. Don't make us the token person. We want to own the process, control the process. We want it to come out of our interests and needs. So they say that mobility justice recognizes that communities are often treated as if they are unfit to design their own futures, to guide public spending, or understand the real issues at hand, which often happens at these kind of meetings where it's like the experts who can actually tell you, well, this is what this costs, and this is how this really works, and this is how you have to do it. And they say we're treated badly in those processes, and we demand that new decision-making systems and structures are created by and for those communities to center their visions and cultivate operating principles that align with their values and lived experiences. And I feel like an earlier phase of the radical women's movement maybe would have taken positions more like that. But we've become so kind of normalized into like planning processes and technical processes and spreadsheets and costing that we've lost this kind of radicalism. So I'm inspired by these movements to think about what would a real gender equitable and equitable in other ways kind of transportation system or plan or something, what would it look like? Where would it come from? Who would be involved in doing it? So some of their other things, they talk about the importance of history, that history matters, and that we need to fully excavate, recognize, and reconcile the historical and current injustices experienced by communities with impacted communities, as I've said, given space and resources for their own political advocacy on streets and mobility, that actively works to address historical and current injustices. So rather than beginning from the idea that, oh, you know, you poor people have been excluded from the freedom of mobility that we enjoy, and we want you to be able to jump on your bike or do whatever too, to say, well, actually, there's these historical injustices that have like created these conditions, and let's talk about those a little bit, and kind of then we can move beyond them. And I think that's important for thinking about gender also, and gendered structural inequalities. Secondly, they talk a lot about identity and intersectionality, that when people live at the intersection of multiple vectors of oppression, unfettered access to mobility and public space are not guaranteed. Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, xenophobia, homophobia, and constraints imposed upon gender nonconforming folks can make the public space hostile to many. Bodies encounter different risks and have different needs, yet this has seldom been the starting point for envisioning more sustainable transportation. It should be, they argue. When cities plan for active transportation, low carbon transitions, or smart mobility, these voices need to be heard. And I think that's really important, and that we need to bring that in a gendered perspective. And thirdly, I mentioned already, they talk about decentralized Eurocentric solutions. And I think this is really important because it comes out of a viewpoint which some people call epistemic justice. So that we can have like deliberative justice processes, we can try to have procedural justice where everybody's included and the process is fair. But if we're lacking epistemic justice, some people, they won't be able to speak. Their ideas will not be heard. That we have different understandings of the world, and it's often difficult for people to express those fully if the context is not their own. And so they call for mobility justice to decenter Eurocentric solutions as the default model, and to look towards dynamic grassroots approaches and solutions coming from elsewhere, such as South and Central America and Southeast Asia. They say this demands language justice and information access that does not exclude some people because they speak different languages, or through professional, technical, or academic jargon. Value the local knowledge of these communities and compensate them for sharing that wisdom. And I think many of us are probably guilty of academic and technical jargon. I plead that. And you know, it's a very different process if you begin with the kinds of everyday languages that people speak, everyday experiences, and then try to plan for more equitable mobilities from there. They also talk about how when we rely on quantitative data to inform decision making, or particular ways of expressing what we think of as facts, here's the data, here's the facts, we may be actively rejecting the knowledge and erasing the struggles and contributions of community residents who may not speak in that kind of evidence-based, kind of factual data. So moreover, they say the experiences and input of marginalized communities are often disputed or disbelieved by institutions of power. And again, I feel like women have been there. We've been through this. And that's like the history of the feminist movement. But maybe we've forgotten some of those lessons and we've become sort of part of the power system. So mobility justice, then, is not just about access to transportation within cities, though that's an important part of it, but it's also about these problems of uneven mobilities and uneven planning, uneven participation and inclusion in planning processes. And let me just try to draw some quick comments about smart cities, since we're talking about smart mobilities also. And I just want to just say a little bit about this, that when you sort of then bring in the smart cities sort of models and discourses on top of what I've already been talking about, there's a lot of hype right now, right? Or let's call it excitement around shared mobility, mobility as a service, smart mobility, and then the internet of cars, the internet of things, automated driving, all of that stuff. And when you think about, okay, what impact is that going to have on these, what kind of relations of power that I've been talking about, it's really problematic. And because of who controls the discourse, who controls the technologies, who's creating the operating systems, who it's for, what problems it's imagined to resolve, all of these things. And as transport geographer Tim Schwanen asks, who and what will benefit from this kind of reinvention of automobility to make it more resilient or more sustainable? And do these urban mobility fixes really deal with the underlying deep social rifts of uneven infrastructure and differential mobilities? We're in the midst of this very competitive, market-driven development of smartphone-supported shared mobility systems and autonomous systems coming. And he asks, does this suggest a persistence of inequitable mobility rather than the emergence of mobility systems that genuinely redistribute life chances and well-being across the full range of urban populations? So I think we really need to call into question the kind of smart mobilities transition and who it's serving and who it's for. And I also like to draw on the work of Adam Greenfield, who in his book Radical Technologies, he offers a great critique of things like automated cars, automated systems, and algorithmic systems, and things like blockchain and Bitcoin and all of these new technologies. And he talks about it in terms of the colonization of everyday life by information processing, whether it's embedded in Fitbits or smartphones or smart homes or smart cities or the Internet of Things. He says these processes enmesh us all in an urban fabric, furiously siphoning up information. But he worries that it's a project of a technical elite that aspires to universality. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that against some of these current visions of automation as a kind of technological fix or a technological system to make more sustainable mobilities research, the way I've been describing it, reminds us that culture, lived experiences, and meanings are all crucial elements of the technological system, including the infrastructure for smart cities, and that those meanings and cultures and practices are embedded in power relations and what I've called kinopolitics. Cities are made up of not just infrastructures and networks and kind of physical assemblages, but also images, narratives, stories about technologically enhanced urbanism or smart mobilities. And all of that informs the sort of struggle over a mobility culture that's emerging. Critical mobility thinking calls for reconceptualizing mobility and infrastructure as sites of meaningful interaction, pleasure, and cultural production, according to Ole B. Jensen. And he calls this negotiation in motion, or mobile sense-making. And I think it's important for us to consider how this kind of networked urbanism is not simply about building a better world or solutions to sort of certain kinds of problems, as many corporations describe it, but it's part of the production of spaces of uneven livability that enroll differential bodies into unequal modes of locational control and into racialized, gendered, classed mobility regimes. So we need to make sense of these smart mobility regimes through a kind of racial, gender, sexual lens and think about the different kinds of negotiation and motion that are shaping that and could shape it differently. And finally, we need to make sites in which all people can participate in mobile sense-making, planning, designing, what some call futuring, and making more just, inclusive, equitable, and sustainable mobility futures. And I'm going to stop there. I've titled this talk right at the end. I was like, I know, I've been thinking about this idea of a mobile commons, and I'm like, it's the Velo-Mobile commons. And then I realized I didn't have time to write a whole thing about what do I mean by the Velo-Mobile commons, and I was hoping you guys could help me figure that out. So I welcome your comments, thoughts, and reactions to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering why the groups don't. I do understand why they don't want a Eurocentric vision or something. But why do they look to Southeast Asia or South America? Why don't they have their own vision and why just look into themselves?
Yeah, so partly they were inspired by the Ciclavia movements that came out of Latin America, and those have been implemented in US cities, and I think they've found that there are activists working within Latin American and I guess South Asian contexts who have a more class-based critical perspective than European cycling planning. And so it's that kind of more communal, maybe even socialist, maybe different kinds of anti-capitalist perspectives, degrowth and anti-extractivist perspectives. They're much more politically oriented, and they're tied to cycling movements in Latin America. And so because of the Latin American population in cities like Los Angeles, for example, they've been able to sort of communicate that kind of political radicalism into the cycling movements, and using the Ciclavia and the sort of community bike riding as a way to share that vision.
I saw a lot of hands here. How many do we? Two. Yeah.
Okay.
4 or 5. But then you have to really specify your questions, right? Okay. We'll take you in a row.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. This is really interesting. I'd like to ask you
Could you please say who you are?
Yes, my name is Rebecca Journey. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago and guest researcher here at KU. I'd like to ask you to say more about how you're working with the concept of livability, how you conceptualize it in your own work, and also how, what your sense is of how these communities, activist communities that you're working with, are in dialogue with how they're also conceiving it.
Maybe
Should we gather some questions? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is very quick. I'm just curious about where the term slow roll Chicago came from. The term slow, is that like slow politics or slow cycling or?
Okay.
I'm reading Richard Florida's book, The New Urban Crisis now, and one of his arguments is that walking and cycling infrastructure is used as creative class carrots, which perpetuates inequality in those things that we did in New York, San Francisco, all that. So I'm wondering what the role of mobility justice activists and thinkers or actors are in mitigating against the new urban crisis.
Okay, we had. Well, yeah. Okay.
I wondered if you could say something. You started with that it was a critique on the Nordic model. I was wondering if you could say something about what you consider to be this Nordic model. Because I, for example, know about the European model. I mean, the Dutch advocates have been involved in starting this Ciclavia, because that is a bit how it also started up in the Netherlands as a as a grassroots environment to say stop the child murder and we want livable cities, not about bike lanes at all. So they wanted to copy the same in South America. So I was wondering what you consider this Nordic model.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, to your last question, the Velo-Mobile comments, and I think actually the project Slow Roll Chicago, where it's basically about thinking about neighborhoods and that the role of the bike is creating communities. The role of the bike is not speed, because I think one of the big issues you could see in relations to inequalities in the biking is actually that it also has to do with speed, like cars has to do with speed. So it's the constant speed discourse. So I think in that sense, that is actually the perfect project for writing about that, because then it's suddenly about something else. It's about creating communities, not about speed.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a lot of issues now. I hope you pick them.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you. Livability as a concept, which I think relates to this final comment about like, well, how can you think cycling advocacy, and maybe you're suggesting this comes out of the Netherlands originally, attempts to create more livable cities by countering the sort of violence of the streets. Car violence in the US happens to also happen with gun violence, so maybe that's not the issue here, but there's other kinds of violence of vehicular accidents, crashes. And so livability then does imply this kind of reduction of speed and making a space in common. And I mean, when I arrived here from the US and I got to, well, first to Amsterdam, I mean, the feel of the commons on the street is so different because people are all aware of each other's different movement, pedestrians and bikes and vehicles, and they're all watching out for each other and moving around each other. And my streets at home do not feel like that. They totally feel car dominated, and everybody else has to like stay out of the way. And so that, I think, is part of the livability concept. And as you say, the Velo-Mobile Commons is a way of kind of organizing politically around that, kind of mobilizing a politics around creating that kind of common space that's a safer space and that's a more livable space. And so, but that brings us to the new urban crisis and the problem of that is walking, cycling, livable streets have become this kind of wedge for the creative class and this gentrification that follows it. And so that's where I think bringing in this more class-based and racial justice-based perspective helps address that and think about it, and to sort of talk about, well, what does it mean if we make those kinds of livable spaces, if they're economically going to exclude other people, that is problematic, and it's happening all over the world. I mean, many cities now are, the real estate prices are so high that people can't live there anymore, or maybe the Airbnbs are, taking over. And so if we're gonna have livable cities, we need to have places people can afford to live also. And so it makes it a more complex, I think, calculus or planning or conversation that has to happen around what we mean when we make a city livable. Who is it livable for? So, and I picked up the word Nordic model just really from the title of these workshops without really having a really clear notion of like what the Nordic model means, except for us it's talked about in terms of Copenhagenizing, and that's often associated with protected bike lane infrastructure. And so our cities, that none of them have that really, and they've just started, implementing it in New York City. My city is about to build its first protected bike lane ever, and we have been fighting just to get paint-striped bike lanes forever. I mean, it takes so long as a political battle. And so what we think of as the Nordic model is linked to that idea of like, oh, that good bicycling infrastructure. And maybe we didn't pick up on the sort of more social elements that were behind that and that led to that. But right now, there's a lot of the idea of bicycle highways, or these high-speed bike lanes is also being sort of brought into the U.S. context, and longer distance bike routes and things like that. So I guess that's what I'm thinking of.
I think I know where it comes from, but yeah, then we can take it later. But yeah, I think that the Netherlands and Copenhagen have been through like 30 years of development, and they have started with lowering speeds and all kind of neighborhood things, I feel. And now they are working on these high-speed lanes, because that is like the last finishing touch in a way. That's not where I felt it started, or it's not where you should start, maybe.
But they are also highly gendered, and we are just to find out because they are used by men mainly. That's another issue. I think that the Nordic model was also a kind of vision in this project, because we don't have a Nordic model in transport. We are very different in the Nordic countries when it comes to biking. I mean, go to Malmö or Lund perhaps, but Stockholm is certainly different. So the vision was to create a kind of, could we empower ourselves, so to speak? We have all this talk about Nordic welfare states and like that.
But oddly enough, in visiting Stockholm, that was the only one of these Nordic cities where I felt comfortable enough to just hop on a bike and start riding, because it was not as dense. There was not as much traffic, cycle traffic. And, and I look at the bike lanes in Amsterdam, there's no way I can just hop on a bike and start riding, because I'll cause chaos, because I won't know the rules, I won't go the right way, whatever. But in Stockholm I could.
I think the problem with the super highways and all that is, don't we kind of like generate a similar system as for the car? I mean, we copied the car system and switch out the word car for bike, which is of course better, it's healthier and cleaner and everything. But we built an infrastructure which is kind of sealing off maybe certain areas, or deny access for certain areas. And I mean, super biking highways, I mean, if they are, which is not the case now, but when they are crowded and bikes, especially with the electric bikes, they bike there, I don't know, 10,000 bikes a day in 30, 40 kilometers an hour. This is a barrier. I mean, you won't pass through it easily, and you have similar problems as with the car system.
Yeah, I'm sure we will return back to these issues later on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks.